The year is 865. Along the misty shores of East Anglia, a fleet of dragon-headed longships emerges from the North Sea like phantoms of death. But these are not raiders seeking quick plunder. This is something England has never seen before. 3,000 Norse warriors, the most fearsome fighting force ever assembled from the frozen kingdoms of Scandinavia, have come with a singular purpose: total conquest. They call themselves the Great Heathen Army. The Anglo-Saxons will call them the end of everything they know. Within 13 years, 3 ancient kingdoms will fall, and the 4th will nearly break. Rivers will run red with the blood of kings, sacred monasteries will burn, and from the ashes a new order will rise. This is not a tale of hit-and-run raids. This is the story of how the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok brought an entire civilization to its knees. This is the brutal truth of the Viking Great Army, how 3,000 Norsemen conquered a kingdom. Before we journey into one of history's most savage military campaigns, hit that like button and subscribe to Wars in History. We bring you the unfiltered, brutal reality of warfare that shaped our world. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's bloodiest conflicts. Now, let's witness the birth of the Viking Age's greatest invasion. England in 865 was a land divided. 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south, existed in an uneasy balance of power. For decades they had endured Viking raids, lightning strikes on coastal monasteries, quick plunder, then vanishing back across the North Sea. The pattern was predictable. The Vikings would come in summer, steal what they could carry, and leave before winter. The English had learned to live with this seasonal violence. But everything changed in the autumn of 865, when the Great Heathen Army landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. It was immediately clear this was different. The fleet stretched along the shoreline, ship after ship disgorging hardened warriors onto English soil. These were not just Danes or Norwegians. They came from across the Viking world, Denmark and the wider Viking world, with others possibly joining from across Scandinavia and beyond. They were veterans of wars in Francia, where they had learned the art of siege warfare and how to exploit the political divisions of kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary English historical record of the era, called them the Missel Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. The name itself was meant to convey terror. These were pagans, worshippers of Odin and Thor, who had no respect for Christian sanctity or Anglo-Saxon laws of warfare. They made oaths and broke them. They accepted tribute and returned for more. They played by rules the English could not comprehend. According to Norse sagas written centuries later, the army was led by the sons of the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. The sagas claim they came for revenge. Their father, Ragnar, had allegedly been captured by King Ella of Northumbria and executed in a pit of venomous serpents. Whether this tale is truth or legend remains debated by historians to this day. Ragnar Lothbrok himself may be a composite of several historical figures, his story embellished through generations of storytelling. But the army was real. Archaeological evidence confirms its existence and its scale. Modern estimates place the force at around 3,000 warriors when it first landed, though this number fluctuated as different Viking bands joined and departed. For the time, this was a massive invasion force. Previous Viking raids had involved perhaps a few hundred men at most. The Great Heathen Army was an order of magnitude larger, and as the campaign turned into settlement, it may have included more than warriors, craftsmen, traders, and families. This was not a raiding party. This was a migration wrapped in a military campaign. The English kingdoms, despite generations of Viking raids, were unprepared for what was coming. Their military systems were designed for local defence and short campaigns. The Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia, could be called up for limited periods before farmers had to return to their fields. The Vikings, by contrast, could campaign year-round. They established winter camps, fortified positions that allowed them to strike early in the spring when English defences were weakest. They moved with terrifying speed along rivers and Roman roads, appearing where least expected. The Great Heathen Army employed psychological warfare as effectively as physical violence. They made peace treaties they had no intention of keeping, lulling kingdoms into false security before launching devastating surprise attacks. They desecrated the most sacred sites of Christian England, sending a message that no place was safe, no oath binding. They executed captured kings in brutal ritualistic ways designed to spread terror. What followed was 13 years of nearly continuous warfare. The campaign would see 3 of England's 4 kingdoms completely conquered and carved up among Viking settlers. It would witness the deaths of 4 kings, the destruction of ancient dynasties, and the displacement of entire populations. Only one kingdom would survive, and then only barely through the genius of a young king who had come to be known as Alfred the Great. The Viking conquest would reshape England so profoundly that its effects remain visible today. Thousands of place names across northern and eastern England are Norse in origin. The legal and social systems introduced by the Vikings persisted for centuries in regions known as the Danelaw. This is the story of how it happened, how 3,000 Norse warriors brought the Christian kingdoms of England to their knees, how they moved like a wolf pack across the land, exploiting every weakness, turning every victory into a springboard for the next conquest. This is the story of ambition, brutality, tactical genius, and the collision of 2 civilizations. This is the story of the Viking Great Army. The Great Heathen Army did not arrive as a raid. In late 865, a large Viking force crossed the North Sea and made landfall in East Anglia. This was an army arriving to stay. King Edmund faced a brutal choice: fight immediately or buy time. The sources suggest he provided provisions and horses, hoping to avert destruction. The Vikings accepted the supplies. Then they built a winter camp and prepared to move. They scouted roads and rivers, gathered intelligence, and waited for spring. For the English, the shock was not only the size of the force, but the fact that it could campaign year-round. The size of the army was itself a weapon. It could split into columns, strike fast, and regroup. It could seize towns, demand tribute, and threaten annihilation. Time was always on the Viking side. The army wintered in East Anglia, arriving in the kingdom's heartland by late 865. King Edmund of East Anglia, a young ruler in his mid-20s, faced an impossible choice. His kingdom had no standing army large enough to confront the Vikings in open battle. His fortified towns were designed to withstand raids, not sieges by a force this size. He could fight and lose everything, or he could negotiate and hope to preserve his people and his throne. Edmund chose negotiation. He met with the Viking leaders and agreed to provide them with horses and supplies in exchange for peace. The horses were crucial. The Vikings had arrived by sea, but England's river systems and Roman roads offered rapid transportation inland. Mounted on English horses, the Great Heathen Army transformed from a coastal raiding force into a highly mobile strike force capable of appearing anywhere in the country. Edmund had just provided his enemies with the means to conquer not just East Anglia but all of England. The Vikings established their winter camp at Thetford, a strategic location in the heart of East Anglia. Here they spent the winter of 865 to 866. not raiding but organising. They fortified their position with earthworks and palisades, creating a base that would be difficult to assault. They repaired weapons and armour. They trained. They planned. English observers watching from a distance must have felt a growing dread. This was not how Viking raiders behaved. Raiders wanted quick plunder and a fast escape. This army was settling in, preparing for a long war. During this period, the Viking leadership structure became clearer. While later sagas would emphasize the sons of Ragnar, particularly Ivar the Boneless, and his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, the reality was more complex. The Great Heathen Army was a coalition of different Viking war bands, each with its own leader. These jarls, or earls, commanded their own men and made collective decisions about strategy. Ivar appears to have been the primary strategist, the one who saw the larger picture and coordinated the overall campaign. His nickname, the Boneless, has been interpreted various ways by historians. Some suggest it referred to a physical disability, others that it meant he was extraordinarily flexible in combat, still others that it was a poetic reference to his cunning and ability to bend like a serpent. In the autumn of 866, the Great Heathen Army struck north. They moved with devastating speed, following the old Roman roads through Mercia and into Northumbria. Their target was York, the great city of the north, second only to London in importance. York was a prize beyond measure. It sat at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, controlling trade routes and communication between northern England and the continent. Its Roman walls still stood, making it one of the most defensible positions in Britain. Whoever controlled York controlled the north. The Vikings had chosen their moment with surgical precision. Northumbria was in chaos. Two rival kings, Aelle and Osbert, had been fighting a civil war for control of the kingdom. The country was divided, its military resources scattered between two competing factions. When the Vikings arrived at York on November 1st, 866, the city's defences were undermanned and unprepared. The Great Heathen Army stormed through the gates, and York fell in a single day. The symbolism was profound. The greatest city of northern England, a centre of Christian learning and culture since the days of Bede, had fallen to pagan warriors in mere hours. The Vikings immediately began fortifying York, which they called Jorvik in Old Norse. They repaired breaches in the Roman walls. They built new defensive works. They established control over the surrounding countryside, securing food supplies and preventing any relief force from approaching undetected. York would serve as the Viking headquarters for the next year, a symbol of their power and a staging ground for further conquests. The Christian population of the city faced a terrifying new reality. Churches were stripped of their treasures. Priests were killed or driven out. The Vikings transformed sacred spaces into stables and storehouses, deliberately desecrating everything the English held holy. News of York's fall forced the rival Northumbrian kings to confront the reality that their civil war had left them vulnerable to a greater threat. In the spring of 867, Aelle and Osbert put aside their differences and united their forces. They gathered an army and marched on York, determined to reclaim their capital. It was a desperate gamble. The Vikings had spent months fortifying the city and were prepared for exactly this attack. But the Northumbrians had no choice. If they did not retake York, their kingdom was finished. On March 23, 867, the Northumbrian army attacked York. Initially, they achieved success. They breached the city walls and fought their way into the streets. The battle became a chaotic melee of close-quarters combat, shield walls collapsing into individual duels, men fighting among the ruins and alleyways of the ancient city. For a few hours it seemed the Northumbrians might prevail through sheer determination. But the Vikings rallied. Their professional warriors, veterans of campaigns across Europe, maintained discipline where the English fyrd began to fragment. The tide turned. The Northumbrians found themselves trapped between Viking forces within the city and reinforcements attacking from outside. The slaughter was immense. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that great numbers fell on both sides, but the Vikings held the field. Both Ella and Osbert were killed in the fighting. With their leaders dead and their army shattered, organised Northumbrian resistance collapsed. The kingdom that had produced Bede, that had been a centre of learning when most of Europe was illiterate, had fallen to the Vikings in a single afternoon. What happened next entered legend. According to Norse sagas, Ivar the Boneless took King Ella alive. The Viking leader had not forgotten the alleged death of his father, Ragnar Lothbrok, supposedly thrown into a pit of serpents on Ella's orders. Whether this story was true mattered less than the fact that the Vikings believed it. They subjected Ella to the blood eagle, one of the most horrific execution methods ever devised. The victim's ribs were cut from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings. The lungs were extracted through the opening in the back. It was execution as torture, as human sacrifice, as propaganda. Modern historians debate whether the blood eagle was real or a later literary invention, a misinterpretation of poetic language in the sagas. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle simply states that both kings were killed, without describing the method. But whether Aella actually suffered this fate or whether it was a story the Vikings spread to terrorize their enemies, the effect was the same. The message rang across England. Resist the Great Heathen Army, and this is your fate. Not just death, but death so horrific it would be remembered for centuries. The Vikings installed a puppet king named Ecgbert to rule Northumbria under their authority. It was a clever move. By maintaining the appearance of a Northumbrian monarchy, they could claim they were not conquerors but power brokers, arbiter between English factions. In reality, Ecgbert had no power. Every decision was made by the Vikings. Northumbria would never again be an independent kingdom. Within a generation, it would become the kingdom of Jorvik, a Norse realm in all but name, where Scandinavian language, law, and customs would replace English traditions. With Northumbria secured, the Great Heathen Army turned its attention to Mercia, the great Midland kingdom that stretched from Wales to East Anglia. In autumn 867, the Vikings marched south and seized Nottingham, a fortified town on the River Trent. Nottingham's location made it strategically vital. It controlled river traffic and sat at the intersection of several Roman roads. From Nottingham, the Vikings could strike at any part of Mercia or launch raids into Wessex to the south. King Burgred of Mercia recognised the existential threat. If the Vikings consolidated their hold on Nottingham, his kingdom would be cut in half, isolated and vulnerable. For the first time, an English king sought help from another kingdom to confront the Vikings. Burgred sent messengers to Wessex asking King Ethelred for military assistance. This was unprecedented. Mercia and Wessex had been rivals for generations, often at war with each other. But the Viking threat was forcing English kingdoms to recognise they faced a common enemy that could destroy them all if they remained divided. In spring 868, a combined Mercian and West Saxon army marched on Nottingham. It was the largest English force assembled since the Vikings landed 3 years earlier. For the first time, the Great Heathen Army faced a potentially superior enemy. The Anglo-Saxons laid siege to the town, surrounding it and cutting off supplies, but the Vikings had spent the winter fortifying Nottingham's defences. They had ample food stores, they controlled the wells, and they knew that English armies could not maintain sieges indefinitely. The third soldiers needed to return to their farms for spring planting. Time, as always, favoured the Vikings. Weeks passed. There were skirmishes and probing attacks, but no decisive battle. The Vikings launched sorties, catching English troops off guard and inflicting casualties before retreating behind their walls. The Anglo-Saxons attempted assaults on the fortifications but were repulsed with heavy losses. Gradually, it became clear that neither side could achieve a military victory. The English could not storm Nottingham without prohibitive casualties. The Vikings could not break out and defeat the besieging army in open battle. A stalemate had developed. King Burgred made the fateful decision to negotiate. The Vikings agreed to peace terms in exchange for a substantial payment of silver, what the English called Danegeld, or Danish gold. It was tribute on a massive scale, thousands of pounds of silver coin and plate. For Mercia, it was financially devastating but seemed preferable to continued warfare. For the Vikings, it was a stunning success. They had been paid to leave Mercia alone, at least temporarily, and could use that silver to finance future campaigns. They had also demonstrated that even when facing united English kingdoms, they could not be defeated. The Great Heathen Army withdrew from Nottingham in autumn 868 and returned to York for the winter. But everyone knew this was not the end. The Vikings had not been beaten. They had been bought off, and they would return whenever they chose, stronger and wealthier than before. The pattern that would define the next decade had been established. Viking invasion, English resistance, negotiated settlement that favoured the Vikings, then another invasion. It was a cycle England could not break. In autumn 869, the Great Heathen Army returned to East Anglia. They had unfinished business. 4 years earlier, King Edmund had provided them with horses and supplies buying peace. But Edmund had never paid tribute since then, never acknowledged Viking overlordship. More importantly, East Anglia was rich farmland, exactly the kind of territory the Vikings wanted not just to raid, but to settle permanently. The army established winter quarters at Thetford once again, but this time their intentions were unmistakable. They had come to conquer. King Edmund faced the same impossible choice he had confronted 4 years earlier, but now the stakes were total. The Vikings were not offering peace in exchange for tribute. They were demanding submission. Edmund could surrender his kingdom, become a puppet ruler like Ecgbert in Northumbria, and watch his people subjugated by pagans. Or he could fight, knowing his small kingdom had no realistic chance of defeating the most successful military force in Europe. Edmund, deeply religious and conscious of his duties as a Christian king, chose to resist. The details of what followed come primarily from later hagiographies, biographies of saints written to emphasize their martyrdom and holiness. According to these accounts, Edmund gathered his forces and met the Vikings near Thetford in November 869. The battle was brief and one-sided. The East Anglian army, largely composed of untrained fyrd levies, stood no chance against professional Viking warriors. Edmund's forces were surrounded and annihilated. The king himself was captured alive. What happened next transformed Edmund from a defeated monarch into a saint. According to the chronicler Abbo of Fleury, writing a century later but claiming to have received his information from Edmund's own armour-bearer, Ivar the Boneless offered Edmund terms: submit to Viking rule, renounce Christianity, or at minimum rule as a Christian puppet under pagan overlords. Edmund refused all options. His faith, he declared, was not negotiable. He would not submit to pagans nor rule his Christian people as a subject of heathens. He chose martyrdom over compromise. The Vikings subjected Edmund to torture designed to break his will. he was bound to a tree and whipped. When he continued to call on Christ, the Vikings used him for target practice, throwing spears at him until his body bristled with shafts like a hedgehog. Through it all, Edmund prayed aloud, refusing to renounce his faith or beg for mercy. Finally, Ivar ordered him beheaded. According to legend, Edmund's head was thrown into a forest to prevent Christian burial, but was later found guarded by a wolf and miraculously reunited with his body. The site of his death became Bury St Edmunds, one of medieval England's greatest pilgrimage destinations. Whether the details are accurate or embellished, the core truth is undeniable. King Edmund was executed by the Vikings in November 869, and his death was interpreted as martyrdom. The Vikings had killed Christian kings before, but Edmund's execution was different. It was public, ritualistic, designed to demonstrate that faith in Christ offered no protection against Norse steel. But it backfired spectacularly. Rather than terrorizing the English into submission, Edmund's death became a rallying cry. He was venerated as a saint within years of his death. Churches were dedicated to him. Pilgrims travelled to his shrine. The Vikings had created exactly what they sought to destroy, a symbol of Christian resistance that would inspire English defiance for generations. With Edmund dead and his army destroyed, East Anglia ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Vikings carved up the land among their followers. English nobles were displaced or killed. Churches were stripped of their wealth. The kingdom that had produced the Sutton Hoo treasures, that had been a centre of Christian culture, became part of what would later be called the Danelaw, territory under Scandinavian control where Norse law and customs prevailed. In just 4 years, the Great Heathen Army had conquered 2 of England's 4 kingdoms. Only Mercia and Wessex remained, and everyone knew the Vikings were not finished. Before we continue with the dramatic climax of this epic saga, I want to tell you about our exclusive Wars in History merchandise. Show your passion for military history with our premium collection of t-shirts, hoodies and posters featuring iconic battles and legendary warriors. Every purchase directly supports this channel and helps us create more in-depth historical content like this. Check out the link in the description below and grab your gear today. Now let's return to Alfred's desperate fight for survival. By the end of 870, the Great Heathen Army had conquered 2 of England's 4 kingdoms and extracted tribute from a third. Only Wessex remained truly independent, and the Vikings knew it was the richest prize of all. Wessex controlled the south of England, the fertile farmlands, the wealthy trading towns, and the critical ports connecting Britain to the continent. If the Vikings could conquer Wessex, all of England would be theirs. In December 870 they made their move. The Viking army left East Anglia and marched west into Wessex, establishing a fortified base at Reading in Berkshire. Reading was a masterful strategic choice. It sat at the confluence of the Thames and Kennet rivers, providing waterborne supply routes and rapid transportation. The old Roman walls offered ready-made fortifications. From Reading, the Vikings could strike at Winchester, the West Saxon capital, or move north into Mercia, or raid along the Thames Valley. Within days of arrival, they had constructed additional earthwork defences, creating a stronghold that would be difficult to assault. King Ethelred of Wessex and his younger brother Alfred recognised the existential threat immediately. For the first time, the Vikings were not raiding Wessex periphery. They had planted themselves in the kingdom's heartland. On December 31st, 870, Ethelwulf, the ealdorman of Berkshire, led the local fyrd in a preemptive strike against a Viking foraging party at Englefield. It was a small but significant victory. The West Saxons caught the Vikings by surprise, killing one of their jarls and scattering the foraging party. It was the first time since the Great Heathen Army landed 5 years earlier that English forces had defeated them in open combat. The victory at Englefield gave the West Saxons dangerous confidence. 4 days later, on January 4, 871, Ethelred and Alfred arrived with the main Wessex army and launched a full assault on the Viking position at Reading. It was a disaster. The West Saxons fought their way through the outer defences, cutting down Vikings in the streets and pressing toward the town centre. But they had underestimated the size of the Viking force. As the English pushed deeper into Reading, Vikings who had been concealed inside buildings burst out in a coordinated counterattack. The West Saxons found themselves surrounded, fighting in narrow streets where their numerical superiority meant nothing. The Battle of Reading became a slaughter. The Vikings drove the English back through the streets they had just captured, pursuing them beyond the town walls. Ethelwulf, the ealdorman who had won at Englefield 4 days earlier, was cut down and killed. Hundreds of West Saxon warriors died in the retreat. Ethelred and Alfred barely escaped with their lives, saved only because they knew the terrain and could find routes of escape the Vikings could not immediately follow. The army retreated in disarray, and the Vikings controlled the field. It was a humiliating defeat that demonstrated the Vikings were even more formidable behind fortifications than in open battle. But the West Saxons could not afford to let Reading's defeat stand unanswered. If they withdrew and allowed the Vikings to consolidate their position, Wessex would face the same fate as Northumbria and East Anglia. 4 days after Reading, on January 8, 871, Ethelred and Alfred rallied their forces and marched to confront the Vikings again. This time the battle would be on open ground, on the windswept heights of the Berkshire Downs near a place called Ashdown. The two armies formed up on opposite hillsides, separated by a shallow valley. It was a classic early medieval battlefield, each side holding elevated ground, neither wanting to surrender the advantage of fighting downhill. The Vikings organised themselves into 2 divisions. The first was commanded by the 2 Viking kings, who had joined the Great Heathen Army. Bagsec, a Danish king who had arrived with reinforcements, and possibly Halfdan Ragnarsson. The second division was led by the Jarls, the powerful warlords who commanded their own warbands. The Vikings planted their banners on the hilltop, the most prominent being the famous Raven banner, said to have been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok and to possess magical properties that predicted victory or defeat. The West Saxons mirrored the Viking formation, creating 2 divisions. King Ethelred would command one, Prince Alfred the other. But as the armies prepared for battle, Ethelred insisted on hearing Mass before fighting. He was a deeply religious man who believed that going into battle without first committing his soul to God would be spiritual suicide. He retired to his tent with his priests, while the Vikings stood waiting across the valley, their shield walls formed, their warriors chanting and beating weapons against shields. Alfred watched the Vikings and realised they were preparing to attack. If the West Saxons waited for Ethelred to finish his prayers, the Vikings would charge downhill and catch them unprepared. The young prince, only 21 years old, made a decision that would define his life. Without waiting for his brother, without royal authority, Alfred ordered his division to attack. According to his biographer Asser, Alfred charged uphill like a wild boar, his men following behind, crashing into the Viking shield wall before it could advance. The Battle of Ashdown became one of the most savage close-quarters engagements of the entire Viking Age. Shield walls crashed together on the hillside, each line trying to push the other back. Men fought with swords, axes and spears in the confined space of the shield wall, where only the front ranks could strike and every foot of ground was contested. The Vikings had the advantage of high ground, but Alfred's sudden attack had caught them mid-preparation, preventing them from using their elevated position to charge downhill. The two forces ground against each other, neither able to break the other's formation. Then Ethelred arrived with the 2nd West Saxon Division. Having finished his prayers, the king led his forces uphill and crashed into the Viking flank. The Vikings, now fighting on two fronts, began to give ground. Their shield wall fragmented. Individual warriors found themselves cut off and surrounded. The Vikings attempted to reform higher up the hill, around a single thorn tree that became the focal point of the battle. Ancient sources describe brutal fighting around this landmark, with both sides desperate to control the high ground. Finally, the Viking line broke. King Bagsec was cut down and killed. Multiple jarls fell. The Viking army retreated in disorder, fleeing back toward Reading with the West Saxons in pursuit. The pursuit continued for miles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the English chased the Vikings until darkness fell, cutting down those who could not keep pace with the retreat. Bodies littered the roads and fields between Ashdown and Reading. It was the most decisive English victory since the Great Heathen Army had landed 6 years earlier. The psychological impact was enormous. The Vikings could be beaten in open battle. They were not supernatural warriors blessed by Odin. They were men who bled and died like anyone else. For the first time since 865, English morale soared. But the victory at Ashdown did not end the war. It did not even end that month's fighting. 2 weeks later, on January 22nd, 871, the Vikings intercepted another West Saxon army at Bussing and inflicted a crushing defeat. The sources provide few details, but it appears the English were ambushed or caught in a disadvantageous position. Whatever happened, the West Saxons were routed, losing many men and much of the confidence Ashdown had provided. The pendulum of victory swung back toward the Vikings. On March 22nd, 871, another major battle occurred at Merton, possibly modern-day Marden or Martin. Again, the sources are frustratingly brief, but they indicate another English defeat. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the West Saxons had initial success, breaking through part of the Viking line, but were ultimately driven from the field with heavy casualties. A disturbing pattern was emerging. The English could win individual battles, but they could not sustain a prolonged campaign. The Fyrd, the militia system that provided Wessex's soldiers, was never designed for continuous warfare. Men were called up for short periods, fought, then returned home to tend their farms. The Vikings, by contrast, were professional warriors who could campaign indefinitely. The relentless pace of combat was taking a terrible toll on Wessex's leadership. King Ethelred, who had reigned for only 5 years, died shortly after the Battle of Meriton in April 871. The cause of death is unknown. Some historians suggest he was wounded in battle and succumbed to his injuries. Others propose illness, perhaps exacerbated by the stress and exhaustion of continuous campaigning. Whatever the cause, his death at age 25 left Wessex without a king at its most desperate hour. Alfred, Ethelred's younger brother, was proclaimed king immediately after his brother's death. There was no time for elaborate coronations or celebrations. The Vikings were in Reading, an army of professional warriors who had just won 2 major battles. Alfred was 22 years old, untested as a sole commander, taking control of a kingdom that had fought 5 major battles in 4 months and lost 3 of them. He inherited an exhausted army, depleted treasuries, and a terrified population that had watched 3 other English kingdoms fall to these same Vikings. Alfred's first year as king was catastrophic. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that 9 battles were fought in 871, though it names only the major engagements. There were also countless skirmishes, raids, and minor actions that never made it into the historical record. Wessex was bleeding out. Every battle, win or lose, cost men that Alfred could not replace. The Vikings could draw reinforcements from across the North Sea. Alfred was limited to the shrinking pool of West Saxon fighting men. The decisive encounter of 871 came at Wilton in May. Alfred led his remaining forces against the entire Viking army. According to Asa, Alfred was fighting with only a small force because so many of his warriors had been killed in previous battles. The Battle of Wilton followed a pattern that would haunt Alfred for years. Initially, the West Saxons achieved success, breaking the Viking shield wall and driving them back. For a few precious hours it seemed Alfred might win a victory that would drive the Vikings from Wessex entirely. But the Vikings rallied, reformed their lines, and launched a devastating counterattack that shattered the English army. Alfred was forced to retreat, having lost not just the battle, but any realistic hope of military victory. By summer 871, Wessex was on the brink of collapse. Alfred made the pragmatic but humiliating decision to negotiate. He paid the Vikings an enormous tribute. Danegeld measured in thousands of pounds of silver, in exchange for their withdrawal from Reading. The Vikings took the silver and left Wessex, but everyone knew they would return. They always returned. And next time they would come not for tribute but for conquest. For the next 5 years Wessex enjoyed an uneasy respite. The Great Heathen Army left Reading and turned its attention to Mercia, the last remaining independent English kingdom besides Wessex. In 872 the Vikings established winter quarters at Torksey in Lincolnshire, on the border between Mercia and Viking-controlled Northumbria. It was a clear signal of their intentions. They were positioning themselves to complete Mercia's conquest. In 873 the army moved to Repton in Derbyshire, in the heart of Mercia. Repton was a site of profound symbolic importance to the Mercians. It housed the monastery of St. Wystan and served as the burial place of Mercian royalty. The Vikings deliberately established their winter camp around the church, digging defensive ditches and ramparts that incorporated the sacred building into their fortifications. Modern archaeological excavations at Repton have revealed the scale of this encampment, finding evidence of hundreds of Vikings living in and around the desecrated monastery. The Vikings also uncovered something else at Repton, a mass grave containing the remains of at least 264 individuals, many showing signs of violent death. The grave included both Viking warriors and English civilians, buried together in what may have been a charnel pit created during the camp's occupation. Skeletal analysis reveals that many of the Vikings suffered from injuries sustained in battle, some showing evidence of wounds that had healed, indicating they were veterans of years of campaigning. The Repton burial site provides rare physical evidence of the Great Heathen Army's presence and the violence that accompanied it. In 874, the Vikings completed Mercia's conquest. King Burgred, who had ruled Mercia since 852 and once allied with Wessex to resist the Vikings at Nottingham, was driven into exile. He fled to Rome, where he died a broken man, the last independent king of Mercia. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler named Ceolwulf II, described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with barely concealed contempt as a foolish king's thegn. Ceolwulf was allowed to call himself king, but real power lay with the Vikings. He ruled at their pleasure and would be removed the moment he ceased to be useful. With Mercia's fall, the political geography of England was fundamentally transformed. 3.5 kingdoms now lay under Viking control, Northumbria had become the kingdom of Jorvik, a Norse realm with a mixed Anglo-Scandinavian population. East Anglia was being carved up among Viking settlers, English landowners displaced by Norse farmers who established villages with Scandinavian names that survive today. Mercia was divided, its eastern portions given to Viking settlement, while the west remained under nominal English control through the puppet king Ceolwulf. Only Wessex remained fully independent, a single English kingdom standing against the tide of Norse conquest. In 874, the Great Heathen Army itself divided. Halfdan Ragnarsson led approximately half the force north, returning to Northumbria. There he distributed land among his warriors, establishing the permanent Viking settlements that would become the Danelaw. These were no longer raiders but colonists, Norse farmers working land that had been English for centuries. The other half of the army, under the command of a new leader named Guthrum, moved to Cambridge. Guthrum was a formidable commander, cunning and patient, who had apparently joined the Great Heathen Army sometime after 865 and risen to prominence through his tactical skill and political acumen. Alfred used these years to prepare. He rebuilt Wessex's depleted military forces, he strengthened fortifications, he reformed the fyrd system, attempting to create a rotation that would allow some men to campaign while others tended farms, solving the problem that had plagued Wessex in 871. He also paid attention to intelligence, developing a network of informants who could provide warning of Viking movements. Alfred was learning, adapting, becoming the strategist who would later earn the title the Great. But he was also realistic. He knew the Vikings would return, and he knew that next time they would come for total conquest. The attack came at the worst possible moment. On January 6, 878, during the 12th night of Christmas, when Alfred and his court were celebrating at the royal estate in Chippenham, Wiltshire, Guthrum struck. The Viking leader had moved his army from Cambridge with complete secrecy, covering over 100 miles in the dead of winter without the West Saxons detecting his approach. It was a masterpiece of operational planning and a complete intelligence failure for Alfred. The Vikings attacked Chippenham at dawn. Alfred's guards fought desperately to buy time for the king to escape. Most died holding the gates and doorways, while Alfred, his family, and a handful of retainers fled into the winter countryside. The King of Wessex, who had spent 6 years preparing for this moment, found himself a fugitive in his own kingdom, running for his life with Viking warriors in pursuit. Those who did not escape Chippenham were killed or enslaved. Guthrum had captured a royal estate and, more importantly, had scattered the West Saxon government. There was no one to organise resistance, no central authority to rally around. Wessex was leaderless and paralysed. Guthrum moved with ruthless efficiency. Having secured Chippenham as his base, he sent Viking forces racing across Wessex. They seized key towns and strong points before local resistance could organise. They intercepted messengers trying to rally the fyrd. They hunted for Alfred, knowing that if they could capture or kill the king, Wessex would collapse completely. Many West Saxons, seeing their king in flight and Vikings controlling the major towns, submitted to Guthrum. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with shame that many English nobles swore oaths to the Viking leader, accepting his authority in exchange for keeping their lands. Alfred fled to the Somerset Marshes, a vast wetland in the southwest of Wessex, where few men dared venture. He found refuge on the Isle of Athelney, a small island of dry ground surrounded by nearly impassable swamp. There, with perhaps a few dozen loyal followers, Alfred established a tiny fortified camp. It was from this desperate refuge that the legend of Alfred and the burnt cakes originates. According to later sources, Alfred, unrecognised, took shelter with a peasant woman who asked him to watch her cakes baking by the fire. Lost in thought about how to save his kingdom, Alfred let the cakes burn and was scolded by the woman who had no idea she was berating her king. The story is probably apocryphal, but it captured a truth. The King of Wessex had been reduced to hiding in swamps, anonymous and powerless. For 4 months, Alfred remained at Athelney. Historians debate what he did during this period. Some sources suggest he conducted guerrilla warfare, launching raids from the marshes against Viking positions. Others indicate he spent the time sending secret messages to his ealdormen, the nobles who commanded regional forces, trying to determine who remained loyal and who had submitted to Guthrum. What is certain is that Alfred used these months to plan. He analysed what had gone wrong, why Wessex had collapsed so quickly, and what would be needed to defeat Guthrum. The Viking leader, meanwhile, was transforming victory into permanent conquest. He distributed land among his warriors, establishing Viking settlements throughout central Wessex. He accepted the submission of English nobles and confirmed them in their positions, creating a collaborative ruling class. He was following the same pattern that had succeeded in Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia. Defeat the English army, kill or exile the king, install Viking settlers, and integrate the territory into the growing Scandinavian domain in England. By spring 878, it seemed the conquest of Wessex was complete. Guthrum controlled all the major towns. The king was in hiding. Most nobles had submitted. One English chronicler would later write that Wessex was nearly brought to nothing. But Alfred had not surrendered, and in hiding, he had become something more dangerous than a fugitive king. He had become a symbol. Stories spread through Wessex of the king who refused to submit, who lived in the marshes like an outlaw, waiting for his chance to strike back. To a population living under Viking occupation, Alfred represented hope. And in May 878, Alfred decided it was time to discover if that hope could be translated into an army. Alfred emerged from Athelney and sent word to his ealdormen to gather all loyal West Saxons at Egbert's Stone, a landmark on the border between Somerset, Wiltshire and Dorset. It was an enormous gamble. If few men answered the call, Alfred would be exposed and vulnerable, his last chance squandered. If many answered but proved unwilling to fight, the result would be the same. Alfred was betting everything on the loyalty and courage of men who had spent 4 months living under Viking rule, many of whom had submitted to Guthrum to save their families and property. The West Saxons came. From Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire, they gathered at Egbert's Stone. Farmers who had hidden their weapons when the Vikings arrived now dug them up. Ealdormen who had outwardly submitted to Guthrum now revealed their true loyalties. Young men who had never fought came to join their king. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that when the men of Wessex saw Alfred alive and calling them to battle, they received him as was fitting, as if one restored to life after such great tribulations. It was a remarkable moment of collective defiance, a population choosing to resist even after seeming defeat. Alfred had an army, but it was not the professional force he'd commanded in 871. These were hastily assembled militia, farmers with minimal training and rudimentary weapons. Many had no armour, only shields and spears or axes. They faced Vikings who had been campaigning for 13 years, veterans who had conquered 3 kingdoms. Alfred's army was outnumbered and outclassed, but they had one advantage the Vikings did not. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their survival as a people. Everything rested on the battle to come. From Egbert's Stone, Alfred marched north toward the Viking base at Chippenham. On the morning of May 878, the West Saxon army encountered Guthrum's forces near a place called Edington in Wiltshire. The Vikings formed their shield wall on open ground, confident in their superiority. They had defeated Alfred before. They had driven him into hiding. They had conquered his kingdom. This would be, they believed, the final battle that broke West Saxon resistance forever. The Battle of Edington raged throughout the day. Unlike Ashdown, where Alfred had the element of surprise, this was a straight clash of shield walls, each side trying to break the other through superior courage, endurance, and will. The Vikings pushed forward, their disciplined ranks advancing steadily, trying to shatter the English line through sheer pressure. Alfred's men held, farmers and thegns standing shoulder to shoulder, knowing that retreat meant slavery or death. Men fell on both sides, pulled from the shield wall to be replaced by those behind, the front rank constantly refreshed as exhaustion and wounds took their toll. Hours passed. The initial Viking assault failed to break the English line. The West Saxons launched counterattacks that dented but did not break the Viking formation. This was war at its most primitive and brutal, fought at arm's length with edged weapons, where victory went not to tactical genius, but to whoever could endure horror longest. And gradually, impossibly, the Vikings began to falter. Their shield wall, which had held firm through countless battles across Europe, began to fragment. Individual warriors fell back. Gaps appeared in their line. The West Saxons sensed weakness and pressed harder. The Viking shield wall broke. Guthrum's army retreated in disorder, fleeing back toward their base at Chippenham with Alfred's forces in pursuit. The Vikings reached Chippenham and barricaded themselves inside, but they were trapped. Alfred surrounded the fortified estate and settled in for a siege. The Vikings had no relief force coming. Halfdan and his warriors were in Northumbria, too far away to help. Other Viking forces were scattered across England. Guthrum was isolated and blockaded, his food running out, his men exhausted and demoralized. After 14 days, Guthrum surrendered. It was a surrender unlike any the Great Heathen Army had ever offered. The Vikings gave hostages to Alfred, something they'd never done before. They swore oaths to leave Wessex, oaths they actually intended to keep. And Guthrum agreed to something unprecedented. He would be baptized as a Christian. 3 weeks after the siege ended, Guthrum and 30 of his chief warriors met Alfred at Alla near Athelney. There, in the marshes where Alfred had hidden as a fugitive, Guthrum was baptized and took the Christian name Athelstan. Alfred stood as his godfather, symbolically transforming the Viking war leader into a Christian ally. The baptism at Alla was followed by 12 days of feasting at Wedmore, where Alfred and Guthrum negotiated a formal peace treaty. The Treaty of Wedmore, as it came to be known, divided England between English and Viking control. The boundary ran roughly from London along the old Roman road of Watling Street, then north to Chester. Everything north and east of that line became the Danelaw, territory under Scandinavian control where Danish law and customs prevailed. Everything south and west remained under Alfred's control. The treaty was a stunning diplomatic achievement for Alfred. He had not conquered the Vikings or driven them from England, but he had stopped their conquest. Wessex survived as an independent English kingdom, the only one remaining. Alfred had secured peace without becoming a Viking puppet, something no other English king had managed, and he had done it by transforming military victory at Edington into a political settlement that gave Guthrum an honourable way to stop fighting. For Guthrum, the treaty was equally pragmatic. He had lost at Edington and could not be certain of winning if fighting resumed. By accepting baptism and withdrawing to East Anglia, he secured recognition as the legitimate ruler of a vast territory. He transformed from invader to king, his conquests sanctified by treaty and Christianity. Guthrum would rule East Anglia as King Athelstan until his death in 890, keeping the peace with Wessex for 12 years. The Viking, who once sought to conquer all England, settled for kingship over a substantial portion, preferring certain power to risky warfare. The Treaty of Wedmore marks the end of the Great Heathen Army's campaign of conquest. What had begun in 865 as an invasion by 3,000 Norse warriors ended in 878 with the permanent partition of England. The Vikings had achieved incredible success, conquering 3.5 kingdoms and fundamentally altering England's ethnic and political landscape, but they had failed to complete the conquest. One kingdom remained English, and from that kingdom would eventually emerge a unified England that would reclaim the territories lost to the Vikings. After Edington and Wedmore, the Great Heathen Army as a unified military force ceased to exist. Guthrum took his portion of the army to East Anglia, where they settled as the ruling class of a new Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom. Halfdan's forces had already settled in Northumbria around York. Other Viking bands occupied Mercia, establishing what historians call the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw: Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and Lincoln. These became centres of Scandinavian power, fortified towns from which Viking jarls ruled the surrounding countryside. The transformation from raiders to settlers had profound consequences. The Vikings, who had terrified England for 13 years, became farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. They married English women, produced Anglo-Scandinavian children, and gradually adopted Christianity, at least nominally. The Danelaw developed a unique culture, neither fully Viking nor fully English, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions blended. Place names reveal this fusion. The hundreds of English towns ending in by, the Norse word for farm or town, or thorp, a secondary settlement, mark areas of dense Scandinavian settlement. But not all Vikings settle peacefully. Some war bands, disappointed that the conquest had ended and settlement lands distributed, left England to seek fortune elsewhere. They raided in Wales and Scotland. They returned to Francia, where Charles the Fat proved as vulnerable to Viking pressure as English kings had been. The Great Heathen Army fragmented into dozens of smaller forces, some settling, some continuing the raiding lifestyle that had brought them to England in 865. Alfred used the peace to revolutionize Wessex's defences. He created a network of fortified towns called burhs, strategically positioned so that no part of Wessex was more than 20 miles from a refuge. He reformed the fyrd system, creating a rotation that kept half the force always ready for military service. He built a navy, understanding that Viking power rested on their ability to move rapidly by water. These reforms would make Wessex far more difficult to conquer than it had been in 871 or 878. When Vikings came again, as they inevitably would find an enemy far better prepared to resist. The Great Heathen Army's legacy was not just political, but demographic and cultural. Modern genetic studies show significant Scandinavian ancestry in populations across northern and eastern England. The linguistic impact was equally profound. Old Norse influenced the development of English, contributing hundreds of everyday words. Legal systems in the Danelaw incorporated Norse customs, some of which survived into the late Middle Ages. The Vikings had not just conquered territory, they had fundamentally reshaped England in ways that remain visible 1,000 years later. In the years following the Treaty of Wedmore, Alfred transformed Wessex from a kingdom that had nearly been conquered into the most defensible realm in Europe. The peace with Guthrum provided breathing space, But Alfred knew it would not last forever. New Viking armies would come from across the North Sea, drawn by England's wealth and the success of earlier invasions. When they arrived, they would find a very different Wessex than the one Guthrum had nearly destroyed. The centrepiece of Alfred's reforms was the burh system, the most sophisticated network of fortifications in the Western world. Between 878 and his death in 899, Alfred established or refurbished 30 fortified towns across Wessex, each strategically positioned to control key roads, river crossings, and productive agricultural regions. These were not crude wooden stockades, but complex fortifications with earth ramparts 20 feet high, topped with wooden palisades and defended by deep ditches. The Roman city walls at Winchester, Bath and Exeter were repaired and strengthened. At Wareham and Wallingford, massive earthworks were constructed that remain visible today, more than 1,000 years later. The genius of the burh system lay not just in the fortifications themselves, but in their integration into a comprehensive defensive strategy. No point in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a burh, meaning any invading army would constantly have fortified towns at their back, threatening their supply lines and communications. The burhs were connected by a network of maintained roads that allowed rapid movement of troops. A beacon system on hilltops provided early warning of Viking movements, giving the burhs time to prepare and allowing the fyrd to mobilise. Each burh was assigned a garrison drawn from the surrounding countryside. The system was documented in the Burgle Heidage, a remarkable administrative document that calculated exactly how many men each district must provide based on the length of walls to be defended. 1 man was required for every 5 yards of fortification. Large burhs like Winchester required nearly 3,000 defenders. Smaller ones like Ling needed only a few hundred. The entire system, when fully manned, required approximately 27,000 men, a staggering organisational achievement for a kingdom with a total population of perhaps 500,000. But Alfred understood that static defences alone could not defeat Vikings. He also reformed the fyrd, the militia system that had repeatedly failed during the crises of 871 and 878. Alfred divided the fyrd into 2 rotating halves. At any given time, half the able-bodied men were available for military service while the other half tended their farms. This solved the chronic problem that had plagued English armies, the inability to maintain forces in the field during planting and harvest seasons. Alfred's reformed fyrd could campaign year-round, matching the Vikings' professional standing armies. Alfred also recognised that Viking supremacy rested on their longships, which provided rapid transportation and enabled them to strike where least expected. To counter this, Alfred ordered the construction of England's first navy since Roman times. His ships were designed to be larger and faster than Viking longships, carrying 60 oars compared to the typical 30 of a Norse warship. These ships were expensive and difficult to build, requiring skilled craftsmen and vast quantities of timber, but they gave Wessex the ability to intercept Viking fleets before they landed, fighting battles at sea rather than on English soil. The reforms extended beyond military matters. Alfred promoted literacy and education, establishing schools and personally translating Latin texts into English so his nobles could read them. He reformed the legal code, creating a unified law code for Wessex that drew on Mercian, Kentish, and West Saxon traditions. He promoted trade and crafts, understanding the economic strength underpinned military power. The burhs became not just military installations, but economic centres, market towns where craftsmen and merchants congregated under the protection of walls and garrison. Several of England's major cities, including Oxford and Winchester, grew from Alfred's burhs. Guthrum died in 890, and with him died the peace. The baptism and Christian name had been sincere in their way, but they had been part of a political settlement between two leaders. Guthrum's successors felt no obligation to honour treaties made by their predecessor. Moreover, new Viking forces were arriving from the continent, where Charles the Fat's incompetent rule had made Francia an even more attractive target than England. These new Vikings had not been at Edington. They had not learned to respect West Saxon military power. They saw England's division and thought they could succeed where Guthrum had failed. In 892, a massive Viking army crossed from Francia to England. This was not a single unified force like the Great Heathen Army, but a coalition of several large war bands totaling perhaps 5,000 warriors, accompanied by their families and followers in a fleet of over 200 ships. They landed in Kent and immediately constructed fortified bases at Appledore and Milton. The campaign that followed would last 4 years and test every element of Alfred's defensive system. The Vikings operated with the sophistication gained from decades of campaigning across Europe. They divided their forces, launching simultaneous attacks that forced Alfred to split his army. They moved rapidly along rivers, using their ships to bypass Burhs and strike deep into Wessex. They made alliances with Danish settlers in the Danelaw, encouraging them to break their oaths to Alfred and join the invasion. They built fortified camps that served as bases for extended operations, just as the Great Heathen Army had done at Reading and York, but Alfred's reforms proved their worth. When Vikings bypassed Burhs to raid the interior, they found themselves harassed by garrisons that sallied out to attack their supply lines. When they attempted to besiege Burhs, they faced walls defended by thousands of furred soldiers who could be maintained indefinitely because the other half of the fyrd continued farming. When they moved by water, Alfred's navy intercepted them, winning several significant sea battles that destroyed Viking ships and stranded raiding parties inland. The campaign of 892 to 896 was a grinding war of attrition in which neither side achieved decisive victory. The Vikings captured some Burhs temporarily, but could not hold them against Alfred's mobile field army. Alfred won several battles, but could never catch the entire Viking force and destroy it completely. The Vikings raided extensively, but could not gather enough plunder to make the campaign profitable. They were constantly harassed, constantly fighting, never able to establish the secure bases that had enabled the Great Heathen Army's conquests. In 894, Alfred achieved a significant victory at Buttington in Wales, where a Viking army had retreated after failed raids into Mercia. Alfred and his allies besieged the Vikings, who were so desperate for food that they ate their own horses before attempting to break out. Many Vikings were killed in the subsequent fighting, though some escaped. It was the kind of comprehensive defeat that would have been impossible before Alfred's reforms, demonstrating that coordinated operations across multiple kingdoms could trap and destroy even large Viking forces. By 896, the Viking army fragmented. Some settled in the Danelaw, accepting lands in East Anglia and Northumbria. Others returned to Francia. A few attempted to continue raiding, but found that Wessex had become too difficult and unprofitable a target. Alfred had not driven all Vikings from England, but he had made Viking conquest impossible. The kingdom that had nearly fallen in 878 had become by 896 the strongest military power in Britain. Alfred's success rested not just on military innovation, but on political genius. Early in his reign, he had recognised that Wessex alone could never secure all of England. The key was Mercia, or what remained of it. After 878, Western Mercia remained under nominal English control through the puppet king Ceolwulf II, but real power lay with the ealdormen who commanded local forces. Alfred cultivated these Mercian nobles, offering them support against Vikings and gradually bringing them into Wessex's sphere of influence. The pivotal figure was Ethelred, ealdorman of Mercia, who emerged as the leader of English Mercia in the 880s after Ceolwulf's death or deposition. Alfred arranged for Ethelred to marry his eldest daughter, Ethelflaed, in 886. It was a brilliant political move. Through this marriage, the royal houses of Wessex and Mercia were united. Ethelred ruled Mercia, but acknowledged Alfred as his overlord. Mercia's military forces operated in coordination with Wessex. The two kingdoms that had been rivals for centuries became, in effect, a single realm with a unified strategy against the Vikings. Ethelflaed herself proved to be one of the most remarkable figures of the age. While royal women in Anglo-Saxon England often wielded significant behind-the-scenes influence, Ethelflaed operated openly as a military and political leader. After Ethelred became ill around 902, she increasingly took over the governance of Mercia. When he died in 911, she became Lady of the Mercians, ruling in her own right. She would prove as capable a military commander as her father, leading armies and constructing fortifications in campaigns against the Vikings. Alfred also secured control of London in 886, taking the city from Viking control and immediately beginning to repair its Roman walls. London's capture was symbolically crucial. It was the greatest city in Britain, a centre of trade and communications. By placing London under his authority and refortifying it as a burh, Alfred established himself as the preeminent power in southern England. Coins minted in London after 886 proclaimed Alfred as King of the English, a subtle but significant title change from King of the West Saxons. Alfred was positioning himself not as the ruler of one English kingdom, but as the leader of all English people, whether they lived in Wessex, Mercia, or under Viking rule in the Danelaw. The treaty that formalised the boundaries between Alfred's realm and Guthrum's East Anglia, concluded sometime around 886, contained provisions that went beyond simple border demarcation. It established that Danish and English populations would receive equal treatment under law, that disputes would be settled through legal procedures rather than violence, and that both Christians and pagans would be protected in their religious practices. These provisions recognised the reality that England was now a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Alfred was not attempting to drive out all Danes or forcibly convert all pagans. He was creating a framework for coexistence, preparing the ground for eventual reintegration. Alfred died on October 26, 899, at approximately 50 years of age. He had reigned for 28 years, transforming Wessex from a kingdom on the brink of extinction into the dominant power in Britain. His achievements were so remarkable that within a generation he was being called Alfred the Great, the only English monarch ever to receive that title. But Alfred's greatest legacy was not what he accomplished, but what he made possible for his successors. Alfred's son Edward, known as Edward the Elder, inherited a stable, well-defended kingdom with a professional army, a functioning navy, and a network of alliances. Where Alfred had been forced to defend and consolidate, Edward could advance and conquer. Edward's 25-year reign from 899 to 924 would see the systematic reconquest of the Danelaw, the expansion of Wessex control over all of southern England, and the creation of a unified English kingdom in all but name. Edward's succession was not unopposed. Ethelwald, Edward's cousin and the son of King Ethelred then, who had died in 871, claimed he had a superior right to the throne. When Edward was proclaimed king, Ethelwald seized the royal estates at Wimborne and Christchurch, declaring himself king. Edward marched against him with overwhelming force, and Ethelwald fled north to the Danelaw, where he was accepted as a legitimate claimant by Viking settlers who saw an opportunity to exploit English division. In 902, Ethelwald returned with a Viking army from East Anglia and raided deep into Mercia and Wessex. Edward responded with devastating force, harrying East Anglia so thoroughly that the Vikings sued for peace. At the Battle of the Home in 902, Ethelwald was killed along with King Yorick of East Anglia. The battle was technically a Viking victory, as they held the field, but strategically it was a catastrophe for them. They had lost their king and their English puppet claimant in a single day, eliminating the leadership that could have coordinated resistance to Edward. With internal challenges eliminated and the East Anglian Vikings leaderless, Edward began the systematic reconquest of the Danelaw. He did not attempt to conquer the entire region in a single campaign. Instead, he followed his father's methodical approach, advancing slowly, consolidating each gain, building burhs to secure conquered territory before moving forward. Between 909 and 918, Edward and Ethelflaed conducted coordinated campaigns that pushed steadily north and east into Viking-held territory. Ethelflaed's role in the reconquest cannot be overstated. Operating from Mercia, she conducted independent military campaigns while coordinating strategy with her brother. She built a network of burhs across Mercia, mirroring her father's system in Wessex. Fortifications at Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, Cherbury, and a dozen other sites secured Mercia's borders and provided bases for offensive operations. These were not crude fortresses but sophisticated defensive works, many built on sites that would later become major English towns. In 917, Ethelflaed captured Derby, one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, the fortified towns from which Viking jarls had ruled eastern England since the 870s. The following year she took Leicester, another of the 5 boroughs. The Vikings, facing simultaneous pressure from both Mercia and Wessex, could not concentrate their forces effectively. When they defended against Ethelflaed, Edward advanced. When they turned to face Edward, Ethelflaed struck. The coordination was devastating, the kind of strategic cooperation that had been impossible when Wessex and Mercia were rivals. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that after Leicester's fall, the Viking army at York submitted to Ethelflaed, acknowledging her authority. It was an astonishing achievement. The great Viking stronghold of the north, the city that had fallen to the Great Heathen Army in 866, and had been the capital of Norse power in England for 50 years, had submitted to an English woman. But Ethelflaed died in June 918, before she could consolidate control over York. She was approximately 50 years old, and had ruled Mercia for 7 years, achieving more in that brief period than most kings accomplished in decades. Edward moved quickly to secure Ethelflaed's conquests. He took direct control of Mercia, ending its existence as a separate kingdom. Ethelflaed's daughter Elfwin was briefly recognised as Lady of the Mercians, but was deposed by Edward within months. It was a politically necessary but historically tragic moment. Mercia, which had been a great kingdom rivaling Wessex for centuries, ceased to exist as an independent realm. But the unification of Mercia and Wessex created something new, a kingdom of the English that encompassed all of southern England from the English Channel to the Humber River. By 918, Edward controlled all of southern England. The 5 boroughs of the Danelaw had fallen. East Anglia was firmly under West Saxon authority. Viking settlers in these regions had submitted, accepting Edward's rule in exchange for keeping their lands and living under their own laws. the Danelaw continued to exist as a cultural region, but it was no longer politically independent. Only Northumbria, the Kingdom of York, remained outside Edward's control. In 920, Edward marched north with a massive army and constructed a burh at Bakewell in the Peak District deep in Viking territory. It was a demonstration of power, showing that Edward could project force wherever he chose. The kings of York, both Viking and English claimants who competed for control of that troubled kingdom, recognised they could not resist. Representatives from York, along with the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde, met with Edward and acknowledged his overlordship. The exact terms are unclear from surviving sources, but Edward had achieved what no previous English king had accomplished: recognition as overlord of all Britain south of Scotland. Edward died in 924 at Farndon in Cheshire, reportedly while suppressing a Mercian revolt. He had reigned for 25 years and transformed his father's achievements from defensive success into offensive conquest. The kingdom he left to his son Athelstan was the most powerful realm in Britain, controlling territory from the English Channel to the Scottish border, with a sophisticated administrative system, a professional army, and a network of fortifications that made it nearly impregnable. Athelstan, Edward's son, completed the process his grandfather Alfred had begun. When he succeeded to the throne in 924, there were still competing claims to power in York, where Viking and English factions struggled for dominance. In 927, Athelstan marched north with an overwhelming force and captured York, expelling the last Viking king. For the first time since the Roman withdrawal 5 centuries earlier, a single ruler controlled all of England. Athelstan's conquest of York prompted a massive coalition against him. In 937, an alliance of Vikings from Ireland and Scotland, led by King Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin and King Constantine of Scotland, invaded northern England with what may have been the largest army assembled in Britain since Roman times. The two forces met at Brunanburh, location uncertain, but somewhere in northern England, in what became one of the most celebrated battles in Anglo-Saxon history. The Battle of Brunanburh was fought with desperate ferocity on both sides. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it in poetic terms, speaking of shields shattered, ravens feasting on corpses, and the sea running red with blood. Athelstan's army, drawing on the military traditions and systems Alfred had created, held firm against repeated assaults. The Viking-Scottish coalition was destroyed. King Constantine's son was killed. Olaf fled back to Ireland with only a remnant of his forces. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle concludes its account by stating that never before had so great an army been destroyed on British soil. Brunanburh secured Athelstan's conquest. The Vikings made no further serious attempts to reconquer England during his reign. When Athelstan died in 939, Vikings from Ireland did seize York again, but they ruled as just another claimant to power within the English kingdom, not as conquerors of an independent Viking realm. York changed hands several times over the next 15 years between English and Viking rulers, but increasingly both sides operated within the framework of a united England. The question was no longer whether England would exist, but who would rule it. In 954, King Edred of England, Athelstan's nephew, expelled the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe. Eric's expulsion marks the traditional end date of the Viking Age in England, though Norse cultural influence remained powerful for generations. But politically, the conquest that began with the Great Heathen Army in 865 was finished. The Vikings had conquered 3.5 kingdoms. They had ruled large portions of England for nearly 90 years, but they had failed to complete the conquest, stopped first by Alfred at Edington, then systematically pushed back by his children and grandchildren. The Viking conquests and the English reconquest fundamentally transformed England. The political geography was simplified. Where there had been 4 major kingdoms and numerous smaller realms, there was now a single kingdom of England. The administrative systems developed to fight the Vikings, the burh network, the reformed fyrd, the taxation system that funded defences, became the foundation of English royal government. The concept of Englishness itself was forged in the crucible of Viking war, as people from different kingdoms united against common enemies. The Danelaw left a permanent cultural legacy. The hundreds of place names ending in Norse suffixes mark regions where Scandinavian settlement was densest. Legal systems in the Danelaw incorporated Norse customs, including systems of jury trial that influenced later English common law development. The English language absorbed hundreds of Norse words, not just terms for warfare and seafaring, but everyday vocabulary. Words like they, them, and their, the basic plural pronouns of modern English, are Norse loanwords that displaced the original Anglo-Saxon equivalents. The genetic impact was equally significant. Modern DNA analysis shows substantial Scandinavian ancestry in populations across northern and eastern England, evidence of the thousands of Viking settlers who made England their home. Unlike earlier invasions by Romans or Anglo-Saxons, the Viking settlement created a hybrid culture where Norse and English traditions blended. The Anglo-Scandinavian civilization of the Danelaw was neither fully Viking nor fully English, but something new, a fusion culture that would influence England's development for centuries. Alfred's legacy extended far beyond military success. His promotion of literacy and learning established traditions that made England a centre of scholarship in the following centuries. His legal reforms created a unified legal code that would evolve into English common law. His conception of English identity, transcending the Old Kingdom boundaries, provided the ideological foundation for English unity. In many ways, Alfred invented the idea of England itself, transforming what had been a geographic expression into a political and cultural reality. The Great Heathen Army had come to conquer a divided land and instead unified it. Their invasion prompted defensive innovations that made England stronger. Their settlement created cultural fusion that enriched English civilization. Their threat forced English kingdoms to cooperate, then merge. The Vikings sought to destroy Anglo-Saxon England and replace it with Norse kingdoms. Instead, they catalyzed the creation of a unified England that would eventually become one of the most powerful nations in European history. But the transformation came at terrible cost. Thousands died in the wars between 865 and 954. Entire aristocratic lineages were extinguished. 3 ancient kingdoms with centuries of history and culture vanished. Monasteries that had preserved learning and literature for generations were destroyed, their libraries burned, their treasures melted down for coin. Populations were displaced, enslaved, or killed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, normally restrained in its language, speaks of rivers choked with corpses and fields left untilled because there were no survivors to work them. The English population that survived was traumatized by generations of violence. Chronicles speak of terror at the sight of Viking sails, of coastal populations fleeing inland when raiders appeared, of children growing up never knowing peace. The psychological scars lasted for generations. Even after the military threat ended, English sources continued to view Scandinavians with suspicion and fear. The trauma of the Viking Age became embedded in English cultural memory, shaping attitudes toward outsiders and warfare for centuries. The Vikings who settled in England faced their own challenges. They were a minority population, perhaps 10 to 20% in even the most heavily settled regions of the Danelaw. They were culturally isolated from their Scandinavian homelands, gradually losing their language and adopting Christianity and English customs. Within a few generations, the descendants of Viking conquerors were indistinguishable from their English neighbours except for their Scandinavian names and the stories their families told of ancestors who had come from across the sea. By the time England was unified under Athelstan, the Great Heathen Army had passed from history into legend. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, whether real or mythical, became the subjects of Norse sagas that transformed them into superhuman heroes. Ivar the Boneless, who may have been a cunning strategist exploiting English divisions, became a near-mythical figure of supernatural cunning and cruelty. The Great Heathen Army, which probably numbered a few thousand warriors at most, grew in legend into an unstoppable horde that darkened the seas with their ships and the land with their numbers. The story of the Viking Great Army is the story of how 3,000 warriors nearly conquered a kingdom and how that kingdom's response created a nation. In 865, England was a collection of rival kingdoms, divided, vulnerable, seemingly destined to fall to Norse conquest like so much of Europe. By 954, England was unified, powerful and secure, having absorbed its conquerors and transformed invasion into unification. Alfred the Great stands at the centre of this transformation, the king who refused to surrender when all seemed lost. Hiding in the Somerset marshes with a handful of followers, he could have fled to Francia and lived out his days in comfortable exile. Instead, he emerged to fight one more battle at Edington, won, and spent the rest of his life ensuring England would never again come so close to destruction. His reforms, his vision, and his refusal to accept defeat gave his children and grandchildren the tools to reconquer what had been lost and create something new. But Alfred's victory was possible only because of the Great Heathen Army's failures. The Vikings conquered 3 kingdoms but could not hold them. They accepted tribute but kept returning for more, teaching the English that submission brought no safety. They made alliances and broke them, destroying any possibility of collaborative rule. They were brilliant warriors and competent conquerors, but poor rulers, unable to build lasting institutions that could transform military success into stable kingdoms. In the end, their very success prompted the innovations that defeated them. The Great Heathen Army's campaign from 865 to 878 was one of the most successful military invasions in history. They conquered the majority of England, destroyed ancient kingdoms, and established Scandinavian rule over vast territories. But they failed in their ultimate objective, total conquest. One kingdom survived, and from that kingdom came reconquest, unification, and a New England that was stronger than what had existed before. The Vikings, who came to destroy Anglo-Saxon England instead, gave birth to the Kingdom of England itself. The legacy of these years remains visible across England today. Stand in York and you walk streets laid out by Vikings. Visit the Berkshire Downs and you can still see the earthworks of Alfred's burhs. Travel through northern and eastern England and half the place names you pass are Scandinavian. The English language you speak contains thousands of Norse words. The legal and political systems, the concept of English identity itself, were forged in the wars between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. The Great Heathen Army lost, but they changed everything. This was the brutal truth of the Viking Great Army. Not a simple story of conquest or resistance, but a complex, multi-generational struggle that transformed both conquerors and conquered. For 13 years, 3,000 Norsemen seemed unstoppable. For 90 years their settlements controlled half of England. But in the end, England absorbed them, and from that fusion emerged the nation that would one day rule a global empire. The Vikings came to conquer. Instead, they helped create. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic military campaigns. If you want to support this channel and get exclusive content, early access to videos, and behind-the-scenes research materials, join our Patreon community. Your support makes these detailed historical documentaries possible. Check the link in the description, and don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our explorations of history's greatest conflicts. Until next time, this is Wars in History.